Yes, the question on the table is whether a late non-call in Aces Sky actually ended Chicago's season. And we're going to dig into every receipt we can get. The popular clip going around says the league admitted the refs blew it. But here's the truth. The WNBA doesn't publish a last 2-minute report. There was no official admission, no public "are bad," and no document from the league on September 19th tying a whistle to Chicago's fate. What really happened is a lot murkier and a lot more revealing about how power, process, and perception collide in the WNBA. The common belief is simple and cinematic. In the final seconds against the Las Vegas Aces, the Chicago Sky were robbed by a missed foul, and the WNBA later confirmed it in black and white. That belief is sticky because it gives a clean villain a single frame to get mad at, and an easy share on social media. It feels like the perfect microdrama to explain a macro disappointment. The contrarian take is this. The viral story glues two different realities together and hopes you won't notice the seam. Reality 1. Chicago's season didn't hinge on one whistle. They finished in the lottery with losses piling up long before mid-September. Reality 2. The WNBA has faced heavy scrutiny on officiating, but the league does not release an NBA-style last 2-minute report. That lack of transparency leaves a vacuum where rumors harden into facts, and clips get treated like court transcripts. When you put those two realities next to each other, the official confession ruined our season narrative falls apart. Here's the plan for this breakdown. First, what actually happened in Aces Sky matchups down the stretch, and were there any endgame sequences that could plausibly fuel the story? Second, why the absence of a WNBA L2M matters way more than most people realize, both for accountability and for the narratives we build after close calls. And third, how much refereeing really impacted Chicago's outcome versus roster churn, coaching changes, and a season-long pattern of losing that made a single whistle feel bigger than it was. We'll pull official standings and game summaries, quote on-record comments about officiating, and walk through the timeline so you can see exactly where the myth got legs. Let's start with the tension at the heart of this. The league doesn't publish a last 2-minute report. That's not a rumor, that's how the WNBA currently operates. Without a public, play-by-play adjudication of late-game calls, fans and teams are left to triangulate truth from broadcast angles, pool reports, and post-game pressers. That structure is important because it explains why clips can metastasize into certainty. If there's no official audit, a viral frame becomes the final word, and the loudest narrative wins. So the very premise that the league admitted the error already asks you to accept a process the WNBA doesn't use, then to graft that phantom document onto the Sky story. Now, zoom into Chicago's season. The idea that a single non-call versus the Aces decided their fate asks you to ignore months of context. The Sky weren't one whistle away from safety, they were deep in the red on the standings long before any September drama. When you live on the edge of the playoff picture, it's natural to fixate on the most recent near miss. But this team didn't implode in one moment, they bled out over weeks. If you were actually going to claim a single moment flip their year, you'd need a tiebreaker on the line, a razor-thin record split, and a mathematically decisive result. Chicago didn't live in that world. It's also crucial to separate two games that got blurred together online. The mid-September thriller that captured everyone's attention, complete with a final seconds heart attack and a building going dark, was Aces Storm, not Aces Sky. That's how quickly platform algorithms can weld separate storylines into the same proof. People saw one chaotic finish, then attached a different opponent to it, the one that better fits their frustration. But narrative cohesion isn't the same as factual cohesion, and in this case it matters. If you're a Sky fan, you're not wrong to feel like officiating has been a season-long storyline. Players across the league have said as much. There were nights where the physicality spiked, whistles felt inconsistent, and tempers boiled. Chicago's own stars voiced that frustration at points, and they weren't alone. But the refs were bad this night is different from the league admitted we were robbed, especially when the league doesn't issue those admissions in public reports. That gap between perception and process is exactly where conspiracies breed. So what actually happened in the Aces Sky meetings that fuel this narrative? In late August, there was a close, competitive game between the two teams that could seed. One call decided it rage. Chicago hung around, they got to clutch time, and then Las Vegas did what season winners do. A few possessions turn, a couple of contact plays go either way, and the champs squeeze out a win. That's a classic recipe for fan frustration, and when you layer it onto a losing season, you get an accelerant. Then, in early September, Vegas blew Chicago out. That second result, lopsided and definitive, never trends because it doesn't support the thesis. What trends is the clip that looks like closure. The missing L2M matters because in the NBA, those reports diffuse or confirm controversy. If the report says, yes, that was a missed foul, fans still get mad, but at least there's a baseline document everyone can cite. If it says, no, correct no call, it doesn't end the argument, but it anchors it. In the WNBA, that anchor doesn't exist publicly. Internally, the league grades officials, assigns playoff crews based on performance, and can discipline for misapplied rules. But that process is invisible by design. So fandom fills the gap with certainty it didn't earn. A screenshot becomes a verdict. A verdict becomes a season obituary. Another layer, Chicago's season wasn't just about whistles. It was about churn. The Sky changed head coaches after 2024 and entered 2025 under Tyler Marsh, not Teresa Weatherspoon. Whenever you rebuild culture, install a new system, and juggle rotation pieces, you accept turbulence. That's not a dig, it's a timeline reality. If you're losing games in June and July because the offense can't space, the defense can't finish possessions, or because injuries and discipline issues cost availability, claiming September's officiating is the singular villain ignores the long arc of how seasons actually break. Let's talk incentives for a minute. Why does the league admit it cost us? Meme blow up while the we lost 24 more times stat sits there quietly. Because the first one offers catharsis. You get a clean story, a hero, a villain in stripes, and a league bureaucracy that owned up. The second story says your team wasn't good enough for months, and that's harder to post. Social media rewards certainty and conflict, not nuance and cumulative margins. But if you're trying to understand how seasons swing, cumulative margins matter more than any single whistle. If we're being brutally honest about game mechanics, you can point to 3 possessions in almost any crunch time loss where the outcome flipped. A missed box out, an unforced turnover, a poor closeout that turns into a 3. Those are team-controlled variables. But we tend to time travel to the final 5 seconds and assign 100% of the blame to an uncontrollable variable, the whistle. That's human. It's also strategically dangerous for a franchise because it tempts you to fix the wrong problem. This is not a defense of every call. There are nights when the whistle shapes outcomes. A drive that should be 2 free throws becomes a play on. A moving screen gets missed. A verticality contest gets whistled late. Without a public audit system, you can't calibrate how often the officials miss or how often our eyes lie. The WNBA has said resources are a barrier to publishing L2MS. Fair enough, but transparency isn't a luxury in a growth league, it's a force multiplier. Every time a viral clip stands in for a league document, you trade trust for convenience. The other reality nobody loves to talk about is that elite teams build margins that survive bad whistles. The aces aren't immune to officiating, they just manufacture extra possessions, win the math war at the arc, and force lineups into uncomfortable matchups until luck can't keep up. That's why your best chance of not getting robbed is to avoid the score being close enough to steal in the first place. The gap between Chicago and Vegas this season wasn't just a call. It was habit, spacing, turnover control, and shot diet. Back to the Sky. If you want to assign blame for the season, start with process. How many times did execution falter in the last 5 minutes? How often did they settle for mid-range pull-ups under pressure? How often did defensive communication break on the weak side when teams ran Spain or Chicago action at them? These are things a coaching staff can fix with film, reps, and better roster construction. They're not sexy, but they're the levers that move seasons. And that brings us to the most useful takeaway for fans who feel burned. You can push for 2 things at once. Demand more transparency from the league, and demand better process from your team. These are not mutually exclusive. Ask for an L2M system, or at least a public post-game pool report standard, and also ask your front office for shooters who protect spacing, a bigger investment in development, and a defensive identity that travels. It's also worth acknowledging how quickly names get misattached to narratives. The post-game soundbite credited in some posts to Teresa Weatherspoon She wasn't the Sky's coach this season. That's not a gotcha. It's an illustration of how thin the sourcing can be when a narrative is moving at the speed of outrage. If you're going to claim an official document exists and a coach confirmed it, you owe your viewers names, dates, and a primary source. If those can't be produced, that's not a scandal. It's a story that doesn't hold. So, did Ace's Sky get stolen? If you define stolen as decided by one missed call the league publicly admitted, the answer is no. The league didn't publicly admit it, and Chicago's record made one whistle irrelevant to the bigger picture. If you define stolen as shaped by a stew of officiating frustration, late-game variance, and a transparency vacuum that lets any clip become canon, then welcome to the real conversation. Because that's a system problem, not a moment problem, and it won't fix itself. Here's the payout you probably didn't expect. The most actionable fix isn't at the end of a blown whistle, it's at the beginning of the next collective bargaining and governance conversations. An L2M style product for the WNBA wouldn't eliminate controversy, it would channel it into a shared text. Teams could point to a line item instead of a rumor. Players and coaches could calibrate their post-game critiques. Fans could argue about interpretation instead of existence. That's healthier for a sport that's exploding in attention. Until then, you have to filter the viral stories with more skepticism. Was that actually the Sky's game? Was that actually the Aces? Did the league actually say that? Or did you see a cut that felt like closure because closure is what we all want? The fastest way to get conned by a narrative is to want it to be true. So no, the Sky's season didn't end on a league-admitted mistake. It ended the way most seasons do for struggling teams. A pile of small margins, a handful of self-inflicted wounds, and a deficit that made September feel like verdict day, even when the math had already ruled. The lesson isn't the refs are fine, stop complaining. It's until we get public audits, treat late-game conspiracy with a long memory and a short fuse, remember the months, not just the minutes. If you came in expecting an official confession, the reality is tougher and more useful. The WNBA owes its fans a public accounting system. The Sky owe themselves a cleaner late-game process. And the rest of us owe the truth a little patience before we screenshot it into legend. Stick around, because next we'll take you inside the locker room calculus, how players and coaches talk about officiating off camera, and how teams build ref-proof habits that survive the randomness. That's all in our Locker Room Confidential series, and it's the real playbook for turning frustration into edge.